For 20 years, my wife, Alina, left our home every Tuesday at precisely 3:15 p.m. She always claimed she was running errands, and because she lived a life so predictable and gentle, I never questioned it. But on our 20th anniversary, after realizing some of her stories didn't line up, I felt something tightening inside me, a quiet fear I couldn't explain. So I followed her. I watched her drive across town, park outside an old brick bank, and walk in without hesitation, as if it were a ritual carved into her bones. And when she emerged 40 minutes later, wiping her eyes like she'd been holding back a storm, I knew this wasn't about money. It was about a past she never shared, and what I discovered next, it changed everything. What secret could a woman guard so fiercely for 2 decades? I used to think I understood every quiet rhythm of our home, every soft habit that made our life feel predictable and safe. But looking back, it's strange how a routine can hold a secret right in front of you, and you never notice until something inside you finally wakes up. It happened one evening, subtle as a flicker in the corner of my vision, when Alina laughed at one of my jokes, yet her eyes didn't join her smile. It lasted only a second, but it felt like a door closing somewhere deep inside her, a door I didn't know existed. For 20 years, we lived what most would call a peaceful marriage. We shared morning coffee in the same chipped mugs, took evening walks past the neighbor's rose bushes, and exchanged those small, warm touches married couples do without thinking. Our love wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind that made people say, "You two are lucky." And for a long time, I believed that. I believed routine was proof that everything was fine. But as our 20th anniversary crept closer, something unexpected began to settle in my chest. A heaviness. A curiosity I didn't ask for. It started with small things, memories that replayed themselves in ways they hadn't before. Like how every Tuesday, no matter the season, Alina would slip out at 3:15. "Errands," she'd say, fastening her coat with that soft, practiced smile. And I'd nod because why question something that had always been there? Still, the older you get, the more you notice the edges of your life, the parts that don't quite fit. One afternoon, I saw a receipt on the kitchen counter, old bank letterhead, dated a Tuesday. We didn't use that bank. I assumed it was a mistake, tucked it under a magazine, and told myself not to dig into things that weren't mine. But the image lingered in my mind like a pebble in a shoe. Later that week, I found another little inconsistency. She came home smelling faintly of an old building, dusty like paper archives, and not the grocery store she claimed to have visited. When I mentioned it casually, she smiled, but there was a tremor beneath it. "They're renovating," she said. Lots of dust everywhere. The lie was gentle, but it was still a lie. And the moment I recognized it, a chill swept through me. Not because I thought she was unfaithful, but because I realized I didn't know what she was protecting so fiercely. The air between us started to feel thin. One evening, while she cooked dinner, I watched her from across the room. She stirred the pot slowly, methodically, but her gaze drifted toward the window as if listening for something outside. When I stepped behind her and touched her shoulder, she jumped slightly. "Sorry," she murmured, brushing it off. "Long day." Her voice was warm, but the distance in her posture lingered like a shadow. Micro-turn. I tried to let it go. I told myself every marriage has seasons of quiet, of unspoken heaviness. But the more I tried to push the feeling aside, the more it pressed back. At night, I found myself lying awake while Alina slept beside me, her breathing steady. I studied the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, lines I hadn't noticed before, and wondered what stories were written in those tiny creases. Stories she never told me. It bothered me how naturally she slipped out every Tuesday, how fluidly she stepped into that part of her life without including me. Yet every time the urge rose to ask, to simply say, "Where do you go?" something softer in me held back. I didn't want to accuse. I didn't want her to feel cornered. Marriage isn't an interrogation, and perhaps I was afraid of what the answer might steal from us. Micro-turn. One rainy Tuesday, the uneasiness reached me in a different way. She stood at the door, buttoning her coat, and I noticed her hands trembling just slightly. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded too quickly, kissed my cheek, and slipped outside. Through the window, I watched her take a long breath before walking to the car. I had never seen her do that before. It was the breath of someone bracing themselves. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not anger, not suspicion, just a quiet ache. I realized I had been so comfortable in our routines that I'd stopped really seeing her. And now that I did, the picture didn't match the woman I thought I knew. She seemed burdened, like she was carrying a weight she didn't know how to share. Later that night, she fell asleep on the couch while we watched a movie. Her head rested against my shoulder, her breathing soft and even. I kissed her forehead and she didn't stir. Her peacefulness only made the questions grow louder. What was she protecting? Why did she need that ritual every Tuesday with such unwavering devotion? And why had she never let me near it? Micro-turn. A few days later, I opened her car door to grab a grocery bag she'd forgotten, and a small scrap of paper fell out. A parking stub. Tuesday afternoon, same time. Same location across town, a place she had no reason to visit. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the slip of paper like it was a message written in a language I wasn't meant to understand. I placed it back exactly where it had been. Pretended I hadn't seen it, pretended everything was normal. But the truth was already inside me, settling into the quiet spaces between heartbeats. By then, our anniversary was only weeks away. I wanted to plan something special to remind us of who we used to be. But every time I tried to picture the celebration, the unanswered questions slipped into the edges like shadows. I began noticing how Alina avoided eye contact when I mentioned the date, how her smile faltered for the briefest second before recovering. It wasn't disinterest, it was something heavier. One night, as we sat at the kitchen table, I finally said, "You've been tired lately." She looked up, startled, then shook her head with a soft laugh. "Aren't we both?" she said. But the way she tightened her grip on her cup told me there was more behind her words. Micro-turn. I started observing her without meaning to. The way she touched her necklace when she was worried. The way she checked the clock around 3 p.m. every Tuesday, even when she wasn't preparing to leave yet. The way she lingered in the hallway after returning home, as if shedding the weight of something before stepping back into our shared world. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who snooped or doubted, but I also didn't want to keep pretending I didn't feel the distance widening inch by inch. And the more I watched, the more I sensed it. Alina wasn't hiding from me. She was hiding from something inside herself. One evening, she sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. "Headache?" I asked gently. She nodded. I placed a hand on her back and she leaned into me, but only briefly, as if afraid she might stay there too long. "I'm fine," she whispered, "just tired." Yet her voice carried the weight of someone who wasn't fine at all. Micro-turn. The next morning, I caught myself staring at her while she poured cereal into a bowl. I noticed how carefully she measured the portion, how she wiped the counter twice, though it was already clean. She had always been meticulous, but this felt different, like she was trying to control the small things because something larger was slipping away. I realized then that my unease wasn't born from mistrust. It was born from love, from wanting to understand the storm she was weathering alone. And from the painful truth that after 2 decades, I still didn't know every part of the woman I shared my life with. By the time the next Tuesday approached, the question inside me was no longer a whisper. It was a pulse, steady and inescapable. As Alina reached for her coat, a thought formed in my mind with startling clarity. Just once, just this one Tuesday. If I followed her, maybe I could understand, not accuse, not confront, just understand. When she stepped out the door, I waited a full minute, my heart pounding in my throat. Then I grabbed my keys, slipped into my car, and quietly pulled out of the driveway, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't notice. And as her taillights disappeared around the corner, a cold tremor ran through me. I didn't know it then, but this single choice would unravel a truth that had lived in silence for 20 years, waiting for someone brave enough to follow it. On the Tuesday I finally followed her, the world felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the air knew I was about to cross a line I could never uncross. I watched Alina back out of the driveway with the same calm expression she wore every week, the same gentle concentration in her eyes. But beneath that calm was something I hadn't seen before, an exhaustion she tried to hide with a practiced blink. That blink was what pushed me to turn the key in my own ignition and slip into the street behind her, my heart knocking hard enough to make my fingertips shake against the steering wheel. She drove like she always did, carefully, patiently, as though she had all the time in the world. But every time she slowed for a stop sign, every time her turn signal flashed in the late afternoon light, my pulse climbed higher. I kept my distance, terrified she would glance in the rearview mirror and spot me. Terrified, too, that she wouldn't, that she would stay steady and unbothered because whatever she was hiding had nothing to do with me at all. The town looked different from behind her car, each familiar corner stretched thin with tension. When she turned down Maple Avenue, a quiet street that led away from the grocery store she always claimed to visit, a cold pressure tightened around my ribs. She had never mentioned going this direction. Not once in 20 years. At the red light, I stopped several cars behind her, leaning forward slightly, watching the way she held her hands on the wheel. They were clasped too tightly, knuckles pale. She wasn't just running errands. She was bracing herself for something. Micro-turn. The light changed. She continued deeper into the old district, where the buildings slouched with age and the brick sidewalks buckled with roots. I followed the soft glow of her brake lights until she slowed near a weathered brick bank with faded green trim. The place looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since before we married. My confusion sharpened. This wasn't our bank. We had never had an account here. But Alina pulled into the lot with the familiarity of someone returning to a place they knew intimately. I felt my breath stall. She parked. For a long second, she didn't move. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a small envelope, and held it against her chest as if gathering courage. When she finally stepped out of the car, the envelope was still pressed close, her fingers curled protectively around it. I slid down in my seat, heart hammering. Watching her walk toward the entrance felt wrong, like peering at a life I had never been invited into. The bank doors reflected her small figure, and just before she stepped inside, she paused. Her shoulders rose with a shaky inhale. Then she disappeared behind the glass. Micro-turn. I counted each second she was gone. At first, I told myself she'd be out any minute. Pick up a form, ask a question, clarify some billing error, but 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter with each one. Finally, I climbed out of my car and moved around the building until I reached a row of bushes near the large front windows. I felt ridiculous, crouching like a guilty teenager spying on his crush, but I needed to see her. Any part of her. Anything that might explain what she was doing in a bank we had never discussed. When my eyes finally found her through the glass, something inside me sank. She wasn't standing by the teller window, impatient or confused. She was at a small desk with one of the staff members, an older woman with silver hair and soft features. Alina greeted her with the kind of warmth and familiarity one reserves for someone they've known for years. They shared a quiet exchange, too soft to hear. Alina slid the envelope across the desk. The woman nodded gently as if they had performed this exchange 100 times. Maybe they had, but it was Alina's posture that struck me hardest. Her back was straight, but her hands trembled in her lap. Every so often, she rubbed her thumb over her wrist, a gesture she always used when trying to steady her nerves. Then, after a few minutes, her head lowered and she touched the corner of her eye. At first, I thought she was adjusting her hair or brushing away dust. But no, her fingers lingered too long. She was crying. My breath caught tight in my throat. Not loud sobs, not anger, just a quiet, aching sorrow that softened her entire face. I pressed a hand to my mouth before any sound could escape. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but the image cracked something inside me. This wasn't the face of a woman hiding a betrayal. This was the face of someone carrying a grief she couldn't name aloud. Micro-turn. 40 minutes passed before she finally stood. She thanked the teller, offering a small, watery smile before turning toward the exit. I scurried back to my car, sliding into my seat just as she stepped outside. She lingered on the steps for a moment, blinking repeatedly as though trying to pull herself together. Then she exhaled, squared her shoulders, and walked to her car with a determination that looked fragile from where I sat. As she pulled out of the lot, I waited a beat, then followed, my mind spinning with questions so tangled I couldn't separate one from another. Why was she depositing something every Tuesday? Why did the staff know her? Why the tears? Nothing made sense. The drive back felt suffocating. The afternoon sun had dipped low, casting a dull gold glow over the street, but I barely saw it. My gaze remained fixed on her car ahead of me, watching her wipe her eyes every few seconds. When we pulled up to the house, she paused in the driveway, looking at the front door with an expression so tender it hurt to witness. As if she was bracing herself to return to a life she cared about, yet struggled to fully step into. I watched her lift her chin and practice a smile in the rearview mirror before climbing out. It was small, polite, and utterly false. My heart twisted, but I couldn't let her know I'd seen any of it. I waited until she went inside before parking down the street, giving myself a moment to breathe. My hands were still trembling. I wasn't sure whether it was from fear, sadness, or the overwhelming sense that I had just touched the edge of a truth that ran far deeper than I'd expected. Micro-turn. When I finally entered the house, Alina was in the kitchen pouring tea. She looked up at me with that forced smile, carefully stitched over the remnants of what she'd just endured. "You're home early," she said lightly. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Quiet day." She nodded, her hands tightened around the cup, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. "Dinner won't take long," she added. "I'm just getting things started." I studied her face, noting the faint redness beneath her eyes. She must have seen the question forming in my expression because she turned her head quickly, pretending to adjust the curtain. "Allergies," she murmured. "Spring is coming early." I knew she was lying. I also knew I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. We ate dinner like we always did, our conversation light and careful. But every time she looked at me, she looked away too fast, as if afraid I could see what she'd been holding back. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat in the dark living room replaying every detail. The familiar way she walked into that bank. The tenderness of the teller, the envelope, the tears. I couldn't escape the feeling that she had lived an entire separate life every Tuesday for 20 years, a life I had never touched. Micro-turn. And yet, instead of anger, what filled me was a desperate curiosity, a need to understand her pain. A need to know why she chose solitude instead of my shoulder. The images from the bank clung to me, refusing to let go. They followed me into the quiet hours of the night, into the pale blue morning light when I woke before Alina, unable to sleep. By breakfast, I knew I wouldn't last another Tuesday without answers. Not because I doubted her love, but because the sorrow I'd seen in her eyes wasn't something I could ignore anymore. As she stirred sugar into her coffee, I watched her hands, steady now, but only because she believed her secret was still safely hidden. A secret she carried so carefully that even her tears were scheduled. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of my next decision settle into my bones. I would go back to that bank, not with anger, not with accusations. I just needed to know what lived behind those Tuesday tears and who they were truly for. The next morning, I woke with the kind of heaviness that settles into your bones before your eyes even open. I knew exactly what I had to do, and yet the thought of it made my stomach twist. Still, the image of Alina's trembling hands behind that bank window wouldn't leave me alone. It clung to me like a shadow. Before I even realized made the decision, I found myself driving back to that same old brick building, the rising sun painting the windshield in soft streaks of gold. I tried to calm the thudding in my chest, but my heart had already slipped into a faster rhythm, as if bracing for whatever truth waited on the other side of those faded green doors. Walking into the bank felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage in a play I didn't know the lines for. The lobby smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, the kind of scent that belonged to institutions older than memory. A woman at the front desk nodded politely, and I forced a smile, hoping I looked like any other man running errands on a weekday morning. A cheerful teller waved me over, short blonde hair, kind eyes, a voice like warm tea. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I cleared my throat, pretending to study the brochures on the counter. "I'm thinking about opening a small savings account," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Just wanted to see what options you offer." She nodded and tapped a few keys. "Of course, we can start that process now." Name, I gave it, trying not to shift under her gaze. As she typed, her expression softened with recognition or something close to it. "Oh," she said lightly, "you're Alina's husband, aren't you?" A jolt shot through me, sharp and cold. She hadn't said it with suspicion. She said it like the answer was obvious, something any employee here might know. "Yes," I said carefully, "I am." "She's lovely," the teller added with an easy smile. "Always so kind, we see her every week." There it was, not implied, not accidental. A truth dropped so casually onto the counter that it landed like a stone in my stomach. "Every week," I repeated, my voice thinner than I intended. "Oh yes," she said, flipping a paper on her desk. "Tuesdays, usually very punctual." She laughed softly. More punctual than most of us, honestly. I felt the room tilt slightly, my fingers curled against the counter to steady myself. "Right," I murmured. "That sounds like her." Micro turn. The teller continued, her tone warm but now more careful, as if becoming aware of how much she was revealing. "She has a private account with us. Been maintaining it for goodness," she squinted at the screen. "Nearly 20 years now. 20 years." I swallowed hard, pushing the words through a tightening throat. "She's never mentioned it." "Oh, well," the teller said quickly. "It's a personal account, strict privacy settings. She set it up that way from the beginning." She hesitated, then added, "We're not allowed to disclose details, of course." Of course, the phrase hit me with a dull thud. Still, curiosity, no fear, pushed me. "Is everything okay with the account?" I asked casually. "Nothing overdue, nothing strange?" "No, no," she said. "Everything is always perfectly maintained. Same deposit every Tuesday, same time, never missed." The world seemed to quiet around me, as if even the hum of the fluorescent lights paused. Same amount, same day, same ritual. The pattern was too precise to be random, too emotional to be routine. My tongue felt thick as I forced the next question. "Do you know why I mean what the deposits are for?" The teller's eyes softened slightly, as if she sensed the tremor beneath my words. She lowered her voice. "Sir, I really can't say much, but I know she asked for complete confidentiality, more than the usual." She pressed her lips together. "Sometimes people set up accounts tied to personal circumstances." The pause after personal felt heavy enough to fill the room. I nodded, stepping back. "Thank you, that's all I needed." She smiled politely. "If you want to open your own account, I can." "No," I said almost too quickly. "Not today, but thank you." I left before she could ask anything else. As soon as the doors closed behind me, the cool morning air hit like a slap. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the cracks in the pavement as the teller's words replayed in my mind. Every Tuesday, 20 years, same amount. Micro turn, I drove home without turning on the radio, without glancing at the scenery. The world outside the windshield blurred into nothing. When I walked through the front door, the house felt strangely hollow. Alina's slippers waited by the mat. A cup she had used earlier still sat in the sink. Everything looked normal, but now normal felt like a lie I had willingly swallowed for too long. I needed clarity, something real. Something I could hold in my hands. So I went to the old drawers in our study, the ones filled with decades of forgotten letters, warranties, birthday cards, and tiny scraps of our life together. I pulled open the bottom drawer, the heavy one that always stuck, and kneeled on the carpet as I sifted through papers that carried dust and time. At first, I found nothing unusual. Old utility bills, receipts from vacations, a postcard from her sister. But then, beneath a bundle of yellow documents tied together with twine, I saw the faint edge of a small photograph. When I pulled it free, my breath caught. It was Alina. Younger, maybe in her early 20s, but unmistakably her. Her hair was longer, her smile softer. But it wasn't her face that froze me. It was the baby in her arms. A tiny child with dark hair and round cheeks, bundled in a knitted blanket. A child who wasn't mine. A child Alina had never mentioned in the 2 decades we shared a life. My hand trembled so violently that the photograph shook. I sat back against the wall, staring at the image as if it had materialized from smoke. My mind scrambled for explanations, cousin, friend, babysitting, but the way Alina cradled the child was unmistakable. It was a mother's hold, protective, tender. Full of a love so instinctual it filled the entire frame. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My throat tightened. I could almost hear my own heartbeat echoing in the quiet room. Why had she hidden this? Why had she never told me? What happened to that baby? Micro-turn. I flipped the photo. Only a date was written on the back, nearly a year before I met her. The edges were worn, as if she had handled it many times before tucking it away. I pressed the picture to my chest and closed my eyes, trying to steady the rising storm inside me. The account, the deposits, the secrecy, the tears, they weren't random pieces. They were fragments of a story she had kept buried beneath 20 years of routine and silence. I wanted to be angry, but anger couldn't find space inside me. Instead, there was grief, heavy, shapeless, pressing against my ribs. I thought of Alina crying in that bank, alone, carrying a sadness she had never shared with me. The weight of that solitude made my chest ache. The afternoon light shifted across the floor, catching the edge of the photograph and turning it a soft gold. I stared at the tiny baby again, wondering who she was, wondering what part of Alina's heart she still held. By the time I slid the photo into my pocket, my decision had solidified like stone. I had to confront her, not out of suspicion, not out of anger, but because I loved her, and whatever secret she had protected for 20 years was slowly tearing her apart. And now it was starting to tear me apart too. I stood in the quiet of our home, listening to the ticking clock on the wall, feeling the weight of the coming storm settle into my bones. And as I waited for Alina to come home, I had no idea that this confrontation, the one I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my head, would unravel a wound far deeper than anything I could have imagined. A wound she had buried so carefully and carried alone for far too long. I knew the moment she walked through the door that something in the air had already shifted. It was in the way her keys slipped from her fingers, hitting the counter with a dull clatter she didn't bother to acknowledge. It was in the way she stood there, frozen, before even looking at me, as if she sensed the truth waiting on my tongue before I spoke it aloud. And when I finally said the word bank, barely more than a whisper, she closed her eyes, not in anger, not in guilt, but in the defeated way of someone who has carried too much for too long and has finally run out of strength to hold it all together. For a moment she didn't speak, she didn't move. She just stood there, hands trembling at her sides, breathing as though every inhale hurt. The silence thickened around us until she finally whispered, "Let me sit down." Her voice wasn't sharp or frightened, it was tired, bone-tired. She walked to the kitchen table and sank into the chair like her legs could no longer carry her. I followed slowly, unsure of where to stand, unsure of anything anymore. The late afternoon light slanted across her face, revealing the faint traces of the tears she thought she'd hidden. When she finally lifted her eyes to mine, there was no shield left, only raw, vulnerable exhaustion. "You followed me," she said quietly. I nodded. "I did." She didn't accuse me, she didn't recoil. Instead, she folded her hands together, staring at them as if the truth were etched into her palms. "I suppose I always knew this day would come." Micro-turn. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her, waiting, letting her choose the pace. She took a long breath, held it, then released it slowly, like she was bracing herself against an old, familiar pain. "Before you," she began, her voice cracking just slightly, "there was another life, one I never intended to bring into this one." She paused as though tasting the words, testing whether they still hurt after all these years. They did. I could see it in the way her throat tightened. "I was 22, she continued. "Too trusting, too hopeful. I thought I'd found someone who would take care of me." She shook her head gently. "But he left the moment I told him I was pregnant. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone." The confession hit me harder than I expected, not out of jealousy for a past lover, but for the loneliness she must have faced as a young woman, abandoned and terrified. She wiped her cheek and whispered, "I didn't have anyone, not family, not friends. Not even enough money for proper medical care. I was just trying to survive." She swallowed and continued, the words spilling out now as if once she began, she couldn't stop them. "My daughter was born in the winter, the coldest winter I remember." Her lips trembled around the memory. "She was so tiny, too tiny. The doctor said she might need extra care, but I didn't have the insurance, I didn't have anything." She pressed her fingers to her eyes, pushing back tears that refused to stay contained. I worked double shifts. I walked everywhere because I didn't have a car. I used to hold her at night and promise her I would figure it out, that I would keep her safe. Her voice cracked fully then, splintering in the quiet kitchen. But I couldn't. I couldn't save her. The words hung in the air like a shattering glass. My breath left me in a quiet gasp. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Not when every detail of her pain felt like watching a wound reopen right in front of me. Micro-turn. She clasped her trembling hands together as though they were the only anchor she had left. She got sick, she whispered. A fever that wouldn't break. I took her to the emergency room, but they asked for paperwork, payments, things I didn't have. Her shoulders curled inward as though trying to make herself smaller. They gave me medicine, told me to monitor her, but by the time the second night came, she wasn't breathing like before. Her breaths were shallow, too shallow, and I didn't have anyone to call for help. A sound escaped her throat, half sob, half apology, and she pressed a fist to her mouth to hold it back. She died in my arms, she rasped. 6 months old, just 6 months. The ache in her voice was so deep, so intimate, that it felt like the room itself bowed under the weight of it. I reached out instinctively, but she shook her head, not rejecting comfort, but needing to finish. Needing to release every piece of this buried grief before it suffocated her again. After she passed, she continued shakily, someone at the hospital told me I could set up a small memorial fund, something symbolic, something in her name. I didn't have much, but I needed to do something, anything, to feel like I hadn't completely failed her. Tears streamed openly down her cheeks now, catching the light and falling like beads of glass onto the table. So I made a promise. Every week I would contribute something, even if it was only a few dollars. I told myself it was my way of still caring for her, still being her mother even though she was gone. Micro-turn, her hands hovered in the air before lowering gently. And then years passed. I met you and you were kind, you were safe. You offered me a life where I didn't have to fight every day just to breathe. She looked at me then, really looked, and her eyes carried both love and guilt in equal measure. I wanted to tell you. I almost did more times than I can count. But each time I tried, I felt that old grief reopen. It was like drowning all over again. She pressed her palm flat against her chest. I was afraid that if I brought her into our marriage, I would carry that grief into it too. I didn't want to burden you with the ugliest part of my past. She drew in a shaky breath. And Tuesday became the day I allowed myself to remember her, to talk to her in my head, to keep the promise I made in that hospital waiting room. Her lips trembled with a bittersweet smile. It wasn't about hiding from you. It was about protecting the one part of myself that felt too fragile to expose. And once the ritual began, once the years started stacking on top of each other, I didn't know how to stop, or how to tell you without breaking something between us. Her voice softened into something so raw it almost didn't sound like speech. I wasn't trying to deceive you, I just didn't know how to let you hold this with me. Micro-turn, the room fell into a gentle, mournful silence. I could hear her breaths, uneven, trembling. I could feel my own heartbeat echoing in my throat. And for the first time since discovering the photo, the secrecy, the tears in that bank, I understood, truly understood. This wasn't about mistrust. It wasn't about deceit. It was about a wound she had kept stitched together with the smallest threads she could find. A promise, a routine, a weekly deposit that let her pretend she was still doing something for the child she had loved and lost. I finally reached for her hand. This time she didn't pull away. Her fingers curled around mine with a desperation that spoke louder than any words she could have offered. The grief in her eyes wasn't something I could erase, but it was something I could share. Something I should have been sharing long before now. She lowered her head, resting her forehead against our joined hands as a soft sob escaped her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want you to see me like this." My voice came out low, steady, barely holding back its own shake. "You don't have to be alone in this anymore, Elena." She closed her eyes, letting those words sink into a place inside her that had gone untouched for decades. And as the two of us sat there in the quiet aftermath of her confession, Surrounded by the fading light and the fragile echo of her daughter's memory, I felt our marriage shift into something deeper, something real in a way it had never quite been before. But that new closeness came with a heaviness too, a morning neither of us knew how to step into just yet. The truth was out now, but the path ahead was uncertain, aching, uncharted. And as I squeezed her hand, I realized the next steps would require both of us. Because this time, she wouldn't have to walk into the grief alone. The morning after Alina's confession, the house felt so still it was almost fragile, like a place catching its breath after surviving a storm. I woke before her, something I rarely did, and lay there listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. It struck me how different that sound felt now. Not ordinary, not routine. It was the breathing of someone who had finally let a buried truth rise to the surface, and was terrified of what came next. When she stirred beside me, blinking awake with eyes still swollen from the night before, my heart tightened. She glanced at me carefully, cautiously, as if unsure whether the world between us had changed too much to repair. I smiled first. A small one, quiet but real. She drew a shaky breath, as though that smile alone loosened something inside her. We didn't speak immediately. Words felt too loud for that morning. Instead, we moved through the kitchen together with a strange gentleness, setting mugs on the table, passing the sugar, avoiding the sharp edges of normal conversation. Even our footsteps sounded softer. Finally, I set my hand over hers. She froze, then looked up at me with a vulnerability I'd never seen so clearly. "I'm sorry I followed you," I said. The apology hung in the air, warm but heavy. She shook her head quickly, pulling her fingers beneath mine. "No," she whispered. "I'm the one who shut you out." Her voice trembled. "I didn't trust myself to survive telling you. That's different from not trusting you." That distinction hit me deeper than I expected. I squeezed her hand gently, letting silence fill the spaces between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, just tender, tentative, like we were both learning the shape of this new truth. After a moment, she pulled her hand back to wipe her eyes, laughing softly through the emotion. "Look at me," she said. "I cry at everything now." "I think you've earned it," I replied. Micro-turn. The next days passed in a kind of quiet recalibration. I caught myself watching her when she wasn't looking, studying the small, subtle ways grief had shaped her life. How she paused before opening a window, taking a slow breath as if testing the air. How she sat on the couch with her hands folded over her stomach, as though still holding the memory of a child she once cradled. These gestures, once invisible to me, suddenly glowed with meaning. She seemed lighter in other moments too, not carefree but unburdened in a way I hadn't seen before. She laughed more softly. She touched my arm more often. It was as if sharing the truth had opened a door she'd kept locked for 20 years, and now warm air finally flowed through. One evening, while washing dishes together, she murmured, "Thank you for listening." I paused, letting the water run over my hands. "I should have listened sooner," I replied. "I should have asked." She shook her head, brushing her fingers along my wrist. "You did ask, just at the right time. The right time, maybe there was no early or late for grief like hers. Only the moment when the weight finally becomes too heavy to carry alone." Micro-turn. A few days later, I suggested we go to the bank together. The idea startled her. I saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes before she nodded. "If you're sure," she whispered. "If you really want to see." I did, not to pry, never that, but to stand beside her inside the space where she had mourned in silence. Walking into that old brick building with her was nothing like following her from a distance. It was intimate, reverent. She gripped my hand tightly, guiding me to the same teller's desk where I had watched her break down only days before. The silver-haired teller looked up, surprised, but her expression softened with recognition. "Alina," she said warmly, "good to see you." Then her gaze shifted to me. "And this must be your husband." Alina nodded, her fingers tightening once around mine before she spoke. "He knows," she said quietly, "about everything." The teller's face changed, less formal, more deeply compassionate. "I'm glad," she murmured. "You've carried this alone for too long." Alina blinked hard, holding back fresh tears. The teller retrieved the file, placing it gently on the desk as though it were something sacred. "Your fund is still active," she said, "just as you set it up." Alina stared at the folder, her voice catching. I didn't know how to stop, she whispered. It was the only thing I could still do for her. I slipped my arm around her shoulders, feeling her lean into me as though her body finally understood it didn't need to stand alone anymore. You don't have to stop, I said softly. But maybe we can grow it together. She looked up, puzzled. Then I continued, what if we expanded it, turned it into something living, a scholarship for children in need, in her name? Her breath left her in a tremor, and when the first tear fell, it wasn't weighted with pain. It was relief, pure and overwhelming. You would do that? She whispered. For her. For you, I said gently. And for the little girl who deserved the world. Micro-turn. The teller stepped back, allowing us space, while Alina lowered her head into her hands and quietly sobbed. Not the silent heartbreak of earlier days, but the kind of release that comes when someone helps you lift a weight you never thought you could share. I rested my hand on her back, my thumb tracing slow circles as she breathed through it. When she finally sat upright, wiping her cheeks with the back of her sleeve, she looked at me with something fierce and bright in her eyes. Gratitude, yes, but also a spark of hope. A spark I hadn't seen in years. I didn't know healing could hurt and help at the same time, she said softly. It usually does, I replied. We completed the paperwork together, signing our names beside one another. When Alina wrote her daughter's name at the top of the form, her hand trembled but didn't falter. And as she underlined it gently, as though tracing the outline of a tiny cheek, I saw something shift inside her. Not closure, not yet, but the beginning of a new shape to her grief. On the drive home, she rested her hand on my knee, keeping it there for miles. The sun dipped low between the trees, painting the sky in warm hues, and for the first time in a long time, the silence between us felt full rather than empty. Micro-turn. That evening, she sat beside me on the couch, leaning her head on my shoulder. I didn't think you'd still look at me the same, she murmured. I don't, I answered honestly. She stiffened slightly until I added, I look at you with more love than I realized I had. Her breath hitched and she touched my cheek with gentle fingers. I'm still afraid, she confessed. Afraid that talking about her will break me again. Then we'll break together, I said, and heal together too. She let out a long, trembling exhale, resting her forehead against mine. You don't know how much that means, but I did. I felt it in the way her hand threaded through mine, in the way her body softened against me, in the way our marriage, old, steady, familiar, suddenly felt new again. Not because everything was perfect, but because she finally trusted me with the part of her that hurt most. And I finally understood the depth of the woman I'd loved for 20 years. The days that followed were different, not lighter but clearer. The air between us carried a new honesty. We laughed more, we touched more, we listened more carefully, spoke more gently. Grief had cracked something open, but through that crack, something softer had begun to grow. By the end of the week, Alina looked at me across the dinner table and said quietly, I think I'm ready. Ready for what? I asked. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass. To visit her, the gravesite. She swallowed hard. I haven't been there since the funeral. A chill moved through me, not dread, but the solemn weight of what she was asking. Whenever you're ready, I said. She nodded, tears gathering in her lashes but not falling. Will you come with me? Always, I replied. And as she reached for my hand, squeezing it with the softest, bravest pressure, I realized the next part of our journey would be the hardest yet. But for the first time, she wouldn't be walking into it alone. On the Tuesday we chose to visit her daughter's grave, the sky felt heavy in a way that made the whole world slower, softer, almost hesitant. It wasn't raining, just an overcast hush that muted the colors of everything it touched. Maybe that was fitting. Maybe the sky knew this was a day that didn't need bright light, only gentleness. Alina stood by the front door holding her coat, breathing shallowly, as if each inhale had to fight through years of memories. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were steady but fragile. Are you ready? She whispered. I nodded, but the truth was I wasn't sure anyone could ever be ready for a moment like this. The drive was quiet, not tense, just quiet in a way that carried meaning. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingers tracing small circles against her skin, as though she were soothing a child only she could feel. Each mile we traveled pulled us further from the life she'd built on silence and closer to the place she had avoided for 20 years. I wanted to reach over, place my hand on hers, but something in her posture told me she needed a few final moments of solitude before she let me in completely. As we turned onto the narrow road leading up the hill, she exhaled a shaky breath and whispered, "I haven't been here since the funeral." Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard, forcing steadiness into the next words. "I couldn't come back. I was afraid if I did, I'd never recover." I kept my eyes on the road but said softly, "You're not alone this time." She nodded, wiping her cheek quickly. "That's why I can do it now." Micro-turn. The cemetery looked smaller than I remembered, quiet rows of stones leaning gently toward the earth, framed by a fence of worn wooden slats. The trees swayed only slightly, their branches whispering with the wind. It felt like the entire hill was listening. I parked, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle. Elena didn't move at first. She stared through the windshield, her breath fogging the glass. Then she whispered, "Can you walk with me?" I reached for her hand before she finished the sentence. "Of course." Her steps were careful, almost cautious, as though the ground might shift beneath her. She held onto my arm for balance, not just physical but emotional. We followed a winding path between the stones until she slowed near a small, pale marker nestled between two larger ones. She stopped entirely then, her body freezing with a tremor that rippled through her shoulders. "That's her," she breathed. The stone was simple, weathered slightly by time. A tiny name carved delicately, a date too short to hold a childhood. A small engraved flower beneath the inscription, a blossom that never had the chance to bloom. Elena reached toward it but hesitated inches away, as though touching it might reopen a wound she wasn't sure she could survive. "It's okay," I murmured. "Take your time." Her fingers finally brushed the stone. She released a breath that didn't sound like breathing at all, more like breaking. She knelt, resting both hands on the earth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's been a long time." Micro-turn. She spoke softly at first, as though relearning the sound of her own maternal voice. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't know enough. I'm sorry I couldn't give you everything you needed." Her shoulders shook. "I'm sorry I was alone, and that you were alone too." She pressed her forehead against the stone, letting years of unspoken words pour out. Apologies, stories, promises, things she had held close to her heart for decades. I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her back, feeling each trembling breath. For a long while, I didn't speak. She needed this. She needed to empty the grief that had lived inside her for half a lifetime. When she finally paused, exhausted from crying, I rested my hand on the stone beside hers. "You didn't fail her," I said softly. She shook her head, ready to disagree, but I continued gently. "You loved her. You fought for her. You honored her every Tuesday for 20 years. That's not failure, Elena. That's devotion." Her face crumpled again, but this time the tears came with a different weight, less punishing, more freeing. "I wish she'd had a chance," she whispered. "Just one more day, one more breath." "I know," I said, "but she has you, and through you she still touches the world." Micro-turn. We brought fresh flowers, white daisies, her daughter's birth flower, and placed them at the base of the stone. Elena smoothed the petals gently, the tenderness in her movements almost aching to witness. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a small, folded note. She held it tightly for a moment, pressing the paper against her chest before setting it carefully beside the flowers. "What did you write?" I asked softly. She shook her head, tears shining in her lashes. "Just that we're starting the scholarship. That her name will help other children now, that her life still matters." She swallowed hard. I wanted her to know. I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. The note looked so small against the stone, yet it seemed to brighten the space around it. Elena leaned back into the grass, breathing deeply. "For the first time," she said quietly, "I feel like I'm allowed to move forward, like remembering her doesn't have to hurt the same way." "That's because you're not carrying it alone anymore," I said. She took my hand and squeezed it, her grip firm, steady. "Thank you for staying," she whispered. "For choosing to stay. There was never another choice." Micro-turn. We stayed there longer than I expected, long enough for the clouds to shift, revealing faint streaks of sunlight that warmed the tops of the headstones. The light touched her face, softening the lines of sorrow, giving her a glow I hadn't seen in years. When she finally rose to her feet, she looked lighter, not healed, not suddenly whole, but unburdened in a way that changed the air around her. As we walked back toward the car, she paused halfway down the path. Her shoulders rose with a deep inhale. Then she exhaled, long and slow, releasing something old into the gentle breeze. "It's strange," she said. "For 20 years, Tuesdays belonged to grief. Now maybe they can belong to something else." "Whatever you choose," I replied, "we'll choose it together." She smiled, a small, bittersweet curve of her lips, but a smile nonetheless. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd really like that." We reached the car, and before opening the door, she turned back one last time, looking up the hill where her daughter rested, not with anguish, not with guilt, but with love, pure and quiet, finally freed from the chokehold of secrecy. Micro-turn. As we drove away, she rested her head on my shoulder, something she hadn't done in years. The weight of her felt trusting, certain. Outside, the sky began to brighten, the clouds parting with the slow patience of a world that understood timing better than we ever could. In that moment, I realized our marriage hadn't been broken by her secret. It had been reshaped by truth, deepened, strengthened. The cracks had let in light neither of us expected. The Tuesday ritual was over. But the memory remained, no longer as a wound, but as a thread woven into both our lives. A thread of love, grief, and now, renewal. As the hill disappeared behind us, I felt something settle inside me too, a quiet certainty that the life ahead of us would be different. Not easier, not perfect, but honest, all the way through. And as Alina laced her fingers through mine, holding tight, it felt like the beginning of a new breath shared between us. One shaped not by silence, but by the truth we finally dared to carry together.